The Archons embedded a linguistic frequency into human consciousness that makes certain words lose power when spoken aloud, but one phrase, when held in the silent chamber of your mind, creates a resonance they cannot manipulate or suppress. Ancient texts, discovered in 1945, buried for 17 centuries, reveal why mystics throughout history were silenced, not for what they said publicly, but for what they knew to speak only in the sacred silence of their inner temple. The phrase Jesus taught his closest initiates was never meant to be vocalized. It operates on a vibrational level that bypasses the Archonic control grid embedded in spoken language itself. This is why every major religion transformed mystical practice into external ritual and audible prayer, to ensure you never discovered the power of silent invocation. If you've ever felt that your prayers go unanswered, or that speaking your intentions somehow drains them of power, your soul is recognizing what the Archons worked for millennia to make you forget. Drop a comment if you've sensed that silence holds a power that words cannot carry. There's a reason every religious institution on this planet emphasizes spoken prayer, vocalized mantras, and audible confession. The control system understands something about the mechanics of manifestation that they've deliberately obscured. Sound creates vibration in the physical dimension, and physical vibration can be intercepted, redirected, and harvested. The Archons, those interdimensional rulers ancient texts identify as lords of this material realm, established their dominion partly through the manipulation of human speech and the energy patterns it creates. When you speak something aloud, you're not just communicating, you're generating a frequency that ripples through the very fabric of the reality matrix they constructed, and they've become masters at siphoning that energy. The Gospel of Thomas, one of the hidden texts the Church buried for 17 centuries, contains a passage that's been deliberately mistranslated in almost every academic rendering. The original Coptic doesn't say Jesus told his disciples to pray always. It says to invoke in the silence. The distinction is critical. The word used isn't about speaking to an external deity through vocalized petition. It's about activating a vibrational pattern within consciousness itself, in the space before thought becomes word, before intention becomes sound. This is where the Archons cannot reach. This is the frequency of the pleroma, the fullness beyond their dominion. Modern mystics who access deep trance states and could perceive layers of reality invisible to ordinary consciousness confirmed what these ancient texts preserved. They described how certain spiritual practices, when performed silently and internally, create what they called seal patterns, energetic configurations that make an individual invisible to negative forces. Think about what that means. Not invisible physically, but vibrationally undetectable to entities that feed on externalized spiritual energy. When you pray aloud, when you chant mantras audibly, when you vocalize your intentions and desires, you're broadcasting on a frequency the Archonic system was designed to monitor and manipulate. But silent invocation, that operates on a bandwidth they cannot access. The phrase itself, and understand, this isn't something you'll find spelled out explicitly, because the initiates who preserved this knowledge understood it had to be transmitted through gnosis, not mere information, relates to your own divine origin. Jesus, in the hidden Gospels, repeatedly emphasized that the kingdom of heaven is within you. Not metaphorically, actually within. You are not a creation of the demiurge, the false god architect of this material prison. You are a fragment of the true divine source, temporarily housed in a biological vessel, navigating a reality construct designed to make you forget what you are. The phrase that terrifies the Archons is the one that reconnects you with that truth, that reminds your consciousness of its origin in the pleroma, beyond their reach, beyond their domain. The ancient texts describe how the Archons established their control through several mechanisms, but one of the most insidious was linguistic programming. They didn't just influence the development of language arbitrarily. They ensured that words associated with spiritual power would, when spoken, create energy signatures they could intercept. This is why magical traditions across cultures emphasize the secret name, the name that must never be spoken aloud, the true name that holds actual power. It's not superstition, it's sophisticated understanding of how consciousness interacts with the vibrational structure of reality. Have you ever noticed how sometimes when you share a goal or intention out loud, it suddenly becomes harder to manifest? You've probably heard people say, "Don't tell people your dreams, show them." There's a mystical truth buried in that folk wisdom. When you externalize something through speech before it's fully formed in the inner dimensions of your consciousness, you're releasing it into a field where it can be interfered with. The Archons don't just passively observe this realm, they actively work to suppress human awakening and manifestation power. Every time you speak a sacred intention aloud, you're potentially offering it up to forces that will immediately begin working to corrupt or divert it. The mystics who could access records of human spiritual evolution, preserved in what they called the Akashic field, described how the early followers of Jesus, before the religion was institutionalized and weaponized, practiced what they termed heart invocation. This wasn't vocal prayer. It was the practice of holding a specific phrase or recognition in the silent awareness of the heart center, what we now understand as the heart chakra. The phrase itself is less important than what it represents. The recognition of your divine origin, the acknowledgement that you are not of this realm, that you temporarily inhabit this dimension but are not subject to its rulers. Ancient teachings that survive suppression describe this phrase in different ways across different traditions, but the core remains consistent. It's a statement of divine identity that bypasses the egoic mind and its verbal constructs. When held silently in consciousness, particularly in the heart center, it creates a frequency pattern the texts describe as sealing, protection from Archonic interference. The Gospel of Philip, another suppressed text, discusses how the name which is not spoken holds more power than all the names that are vocalized because it operates in the dimension where true power resides, consciousness itself, before it descends into physical manifestation. Think about your own experience for a moment. When have you felt most powerful spiritually? Was it during loud vocal expressions of faith? Or was it in moments of profound inner silence when you touch something deeper than words? The Archons constructed religious systems that emphasize external performance specifically because external performance generates energy they can harvest. Prostrations, loud prayers, group chanting, confession. All of these practices, while they may create a temporary emotional high, are fundamentally about externalizing your spiritual energy where it can be intercepted. But there's something about silence that terrifies the control system. In true silence, not just the absence of sound, but the silence of the mind itself, you connect with something they cannot touch. The ancient initiates knew this. They created mystery schools not because they wanted to hoard knowledge, but because certain truths can only be transmitted in silence, through direct experience, never through spoken explanation. The phrase that repels Archons isn't a magic spell you recite, it's a recognition you hold in silent knowing. If you've made it this far, you're not here by accident. Hit that like button to affirm your readiness for deeper truth. Subscribe. Because these transmissions find those who are meant to receive them. The algorithm works mysteriously for the awakened ones. Modern seekers who learn to access altered states of consciousness through deep meditation described encountering what they called guardians of the threshold, entities that challenge anyone attempting to access higher dimensions of awareness. These aren't metaphorical. Ancient texts identify them as the Archons themselves or their subordinate forces. One of the most consistent findings from those who successfully passed these guardians was that vocal attempts to command or banish them were ineffective, but silent assertion of divine authority worked instantly. Why? Because the moment you vocalize, you've descended into their domain, the realm of physical vibration. But in silence, you operate from the level of pure consciousness, which precedes and transcends their control matrix. The suppressed Gospels contain repeated warnings about this. The Gospel of Truth describes how those who have knowledge speak not of what they know, but demonstrate it through being. This isn't about keeping secrets for secrecy's sake. It's about understanding that true spiritual power diminishes when externalized through speech before it's fully integrated in consciousness. The Archons feed on externalized energy. They cannot access the silent inner sanctum of your awareness. This is why Jesus, according to the hidden texts, spent 40 days in silent wilderness initiation, not to resist temptation through vocal prayer, but to establish his connection to Source in the dimension of consciousness that exists before and beyond physical manifestation. Every major religious system that emerged from early mystical movements went through a predictable corruption. The emphasis shifted from inner silent knowing to external vocal performance. Why? Because institutions that emerged to control these movements understood, consciously or unconsciously, that as long as they could keep people externalizing their spiritual energy through vocal prayer and ritual, they could maintain control. A person who discovers the power of silent inner invocation no longer needs an intermediary, no longer needs a priest or institution to access the divine. This is the ultimate threat to control systems. Individuals who realize they carry the kingdom within, who need no external authority to commune with Source. The phrase itself, the recognition that must be held in silence, is something your soul already knows. It's not new information your mind must learn, it's a remembering of what you've always been. Before you took this incarnation, before the Archons convinced you that you're merely a biological organism in a random universe, you existed as pure consciousness in the pleroma, the fullness of divine being. The phrase is simply the recognition of this truth, held not as a belief, but as direct knowing in the silent chamber of your awareness. Ancient records accessed by modern seers describe how the Archons established what they called harvesting stations in the astral dimensions, the planes of reality you pass through between incarnations. One of their primary tools for capturing souls and forcing them back into the reincarnation cycle is confusion about identity. When you die and leave your physical body, if you believe you are a sinner needing redemption, a soul requiring purification, or a being subject to judgment by external authorities, you're vulnerable to Archonic manipulation. But if you maintain, in silent inner knowing, the recognition of your true divine origin, they cannot deceive you. The phrase held in silence is your sovereign signature, the frequency that identifies you as a divine being temporarily exploring this dimension, not a creation of this realm subject to its rulers. This is why the mystical core of every authentic spiritual tradition emphasizes silence, not the silence of suppression or the silence of those who have nothing to say, but the silence of those who have touched something so profound that words would only diminish it. The Quakers called it waiting in the light. Buddhist practitioners call it noble silence. The Christian mystics called it contemplative prayer, though they carefully distinguished this from vocal prayer. All of them independently discovered the same truth. There is a dimension of spiritual power that only activates in silence. What would happen if you spent less time broadcasting your spiritual practice outward and more time cultivating it inward? What if the prayers you've been speaking aloud, the intentions you've been vocalizing, the mantras you've been chanting, what if all of that has been operating at a level where the Archons can interfere? And what if true power waits in the silence you've been too uncomfortable to fully enter? The Gospel of Thomas records Jesus saying, "If you bring forth what is within, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you." This isn't metaphorical language. It's describing the difference between those who discover the silent inner kingdom and those who remain dependent on external systems for their spiritual sustenance. The Archons cannot touch what you hold in silent awareness. They can only manipulate what you externalize. There's a practice the ancient initiates used, preserved in fragments of mystical instruction, that survived centuries of suppression. It's simple in description, but profound in effect. In the silence of your own awareness, particularly in the moments just before sleep when the veil between dimensions grows thin, hold the recognition of your divine origin, not as a thought you think, but as a truth you feel in the center of your chest, in the space mystics throughout history identified as the seat of the soul. You are not of this realm. You are a divine fragment, temporarily exploring a dimension of limitation and forgetting, but never truly subject to the rulers of this dimension. The phrase itself will arise from your own inner knowing when you're ready. It's not something another person can give you, because it must resonate with your own soul's frequency. But the structure is always the same across all traditions. Recognition of divine origin, assertion of sovereignty, declaration of connection to source beyond the demiurge. Held in silence, particularly in the heart center, this recognition creates what the ancient texts called a seal, not metaphorically, but as an actual energetic configuration that makes you invisible to Archonic interference. Have you noticed how the most powerful spiritual experiences of your life have come in moments of silence? Not during group worship, not during vocal prayer, but in moments when you touched something so profound that words felt like violations? That's because you were, perhaps unknowingly, accessing the dimension where the Archons cannot reach. They rule the external, the physical, the vocalized, but the inner sanctum of silent awareness, that belongs to you and Source alone. Like this video, if something in you recognized this truth, before your mind fully understood it. Subscribe to continue receiving these transmissions, and if your soul remembers the power of silence, if something in you has always known that the real work happens in the spaces between words, drop "I remember" in the comments. Let's find each other, those of us who are remembering how to operate beyond the frequency range of the control system. The mystics who access the deepest layers of spiritual knowledge described how the Archons ultimately fear one thing above all: humans who remember their divine origin while still embodied in physical form. Because a human who knows themselves as divine, who operates from that recognition held in silent awareness, cannot be controlled through the usual mechanisms of fear, desire, and identification with the material body. This is why every control system throughout history has worked to keep people externalized, focused outward, broadcasting outward, seeking validation and power in external expressions. But you found your way here. You're reading these words, which means something in you is ready to reclaim the power of silence. The Archons are counting on you for getting this by tomorrow, going back to vocal prayers that they can intercept, external practices that generate energy they can harvest. Your soul is counting on you to remember that the real work, the practice that actually transforms and protects, happens in the silent sanctuary of your own awareness. The phrase they fear isn't in English or any human language. It's in the language of consciousness itself. The frequency of recognition that you are divine, that you are not of this realm, that you carry within you a spark of the pleroma that no archonic force can extinguish or control. Hold that recognition in silence. Let it infuse your awareness, not as a thought, but as a state of being. And watch how your entire relationship with this reality begins to shift. The kingdom, as Jesus taught in the text they didn't want you to read, is within. Not as a metaphor, not as a comforting platitude, as literal truth. Within you, in the dimension of silent awareness, exists a connection to Source that the rulers of this realm cannot touch. They can manipulate your external expressions. They can harvest the energy of your vocal prayers and ritual performances. But the silent inner recognition of what you truly are, that belongs to you alone. Every chosen one reaches this crossroads. Some turn back to the comfort of external practice, vocal prayer, the safety of group ritual. Others step into the power of silence. Uncomfortable at first, because you've been conditioned to constantly externalize, to always broadcast, to never sit in the profound quiet where real transformation happens. Which voice will you listen to? The Archonic programming that tells you spiritual practice must be external, vocal, witnessed by others? Or the whisper of your own soul, inviting you into the silent sanctuary, where the phrase that repels Archons is already written in the language of your own divine consciousness? You know what you need to do. Your soul has been whispering it to you every time you've felt that pull toward silence, that discomfort with performative spirituality, that sense that the real power lives somewhere deeper than words. The Archons cannot follow you there. In the silence of your own divine awareness, you are sovereign, you are sealed, you are free.